Hello, everyone. Um, this presentation is titled Definition and Perspectives on Peace and Conflict. And the objective here is to discover some of the definitions, or the major definitions that there are as to peace and conflict. What are the perspectives that are involved in the subject matter? So it's basically going to lay the foundation for subsequent conversations that we're going to have on this in this course. So I expect that you pay attention, note questions, observations, comments that you might have for discussion. Now, conflict is central to our daily lives. There's hardly any of us who hasn't been in a conflict situation, whether individual, or at home in the larger society, in our workplace where we intern, or even in the church, in religious environments, or in the mosque, as the case may be. So conflict, is a very broad subject matter which has become indispensable. We can hardly do without conflict in our daily lives, and that is because of the nature of man. Our interaction with one another in groups as individuals, you know, and in several other things that we find ourselves engaging in. So conflict, of course, on one hand, can cause growth and development. It can lead to prosperity. It can lead to innovation. And on the other hand, as well, conflict can also be a source of disaster and chaos. Conflicts can lead to serious harm and destruction. So it is more like a two-edged sword. On one hand, it can lead to innovation, development. On the other hand, it can also lead to chaos and disaster. And conflict has, of course, been defined by various people depending on the perspective from which they view the concept, depending on their profession as well. People have various meanings for the concept of conflict, but conflict generally um, is referred to as a clash of interests. So when you have interests that are clashing, whether it is individual interests or group interests, um, whenever interests clash, it is said that conflict has occurred, and we're going to find out how this definition, is useful as we continue this conversation. Some of the basis for conflict, as you can see on this slide, include personal, issues, racial issues, and of course, we have had so much of these racial issues or racial basis for conflicts in the West, especially in the US, with the Black Lives Matter and all the various struggles, for over racist actions and perceived, injustice, as the case may be. So class, political, international, I mean, there's so many bases for conflict. All right, but let's keep at the back of our mind that conflict, basically or generally, um, refers to a clash of interest. Now, the biblical perspective on the origin of conflict takes us to the book of Revelations, which is the last book of the Bible, Revelation 12, verses 17, verse 7 to 11. All right, and here you see a conflict unfolding between two actors, the dragon on one hand and Michael on the other hand. All right, and it is seen that there's a war, which of course we don't have an idea of exactly how the war unfolded or how the war occurred, whether what weapons were used, the various defense strategies that were employed and all of that. Those are not before us to debate. What the Bible tells us is that there was war in heaven. How the war occurred and how it unfolded, um, we'll get to understand it perhaps when we get to heaven. All right, but there was a battle, and eventually Michael prevailed, and the dragon was cast out of heaven because his place was not found there anymore. But the question is, why did the war occur? What what prompted, what was the motivation for that war in heaven? We're told that the war was a result of certain um, emotions, that the dragon had, which eventually manifested into actions all right, and eventually it became toxic. Those actions became toxic. Those interactions became toxic with, I mean, with other heavenly beings, other angels, and it was not safe anymore for the dragon, which was originally known as Lucifer, to remain in heaven. And so the result was that the war occurred, and the dragon was cast out, to the earth with one third of the angels. So this is some kind of biblical background, as to the origin of conflict. The origin of conflict. Some call it the origin of sin, but whatever it is that you want to call it, it is. One can argue that conflict began, or this story, this passage, lays a good foundation for the origin of conflict. And one of the questions that continue to bother so many people is you know where did this pride, because it says a pride, arrogance, lack of contentment, were some of the emotions that the dragon had. So the question is, where did these emotions come from? How did these emotions get into the mind of Lucifer, into the psychology of Lucifer or the dragon? And all of those questions remain unanswered. Now, the history of conflict, coming down, to 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 the academic realm, the history of conflict, of course, dates, is varied. Several there's so much literature on how conflict occurs, or how conflict has originated or evolved over the years. All right, but one of those that is very, very instructive is the one proposed by Best 2004. In trying to understand conflict, it's important that one must look at the distant past. The distant past is an aspect that must be interrogated. The immediate past as well must be also interrogated, as well as the current event. So conflict does not occur. Conflict does not occur. In order to understand the conflict, the reason why there's a clash of interests, or why a particular conflict event occurs. For instance, um, you find out that you do something at home, and then perhaps you get scolded by your mom, or you get beaten up by your sibling. The reason why your sibling has beaten you up will not necessarily be because of that singular event that you have done. You know, in trying to understand why your sibling has beaten you up, there's a need to understand, to look into the distant past. What has been the behavior between you and your sibling over a very long period of time? How have the two of you been interacting? What has been, the events that have happened that day, perhaps since from the morning, in terms of the immediate past context? All right. What has happened since morning up to the time when you were beaten up? What has happened in the last 24 hours before when you were beaten up? All right. Before you look at the current event as to what you did, particularly that resulted in you being beaten up. So conflict must be looked at, from these various perspectives. If you want to really understand why is it that a conflict has occurred, you must look at it from the distant past perspective, from the immediate past perspective, and of course, x-ray also the current event that has resulted in that conflict. Okay. So this is what Best argues as to how to understand conflict. So the point to understand in these best dimensions of conflict, of understanding conflict, is the fact that the current event alone is not sufficient to explain conflict. All right, the current event alone is not sufficient to explain conflict. In trying to explain conflict, there has to be a wider investigation. There has to be a wider look. You have to look beyond what has just happened in trying to understand what has just happened. That is, it sounds funny, but that is the truth. You have to look beyond what has just happened. Look into the distant past. Over the years, what has been going on in the last 48 to 24 72 hours, what has happened before you look at the current event on the conflict. This wider look, this broader perspective will help you better understand why a conflict has occurred. All right. Now, the sociological definition of conflict, or the sociological understanding of conflict, um, basically has to do with the process or situation, as it says on your screen, where you know two or more people in a relationship or a group, where where there's an active threat to the purpose of other people, or there's an active threat in trying to prevent other people's interest, or in even trying to cause injury, or destroy others. That is the sociological definition of conflict. It has to do and with actively threatening the purpose of other people, in actively trying to prevent other people's interest, or in even causing, inflicting harm, injury, or destruction, whether to life or property of other people. And we see this unfolding in society every single day. All right, we see in society that people are actively threatening the purposes of others. People are actively threatening the interests of others. People are actively trying, and succeeding in most cases to cause harm and destruction to others. That is sociologically the understanding of conflict. All right, and of course, in some cases too, sociological conflict can be unorganized. It can be enduring. I mean, that means it can last for over a period of years or months or days. You can have conflicts that stretch and last for so long a time. You can have conflicts that are physical. You can have conflicts that are intellectual. That are organized or unorganized. So social conflicts can vary in how they manifest. All right, but essentially, what social conflicts are about are, have to do with threats to the purpose, interest of others, or even trying to cause harm to other people. All right. Um, of course, conflict, is a social process, as it is said, where individuals, want to always challenge their opposition. So if you have an opposition to your goals, your aspirations, your dreams, you want to challenge that opposition. You want to challenge the opposition that you consider as being antagonistic to whatever interest or purposes, you know that you want to achieve. And so this social process involves some kind of challenge to this opposition, and sometimes that challenge can be violent, sometimes it can be non-violent, as the case may be. So that is a sociological understanding of conflict. It happens in society. It is based on threats to the purpose interest of people, or even trying to cause harm to them. And of course, it manifests in more ways than one. Now, psychologically, conflict has to do with an awakening of more than one motive, that cannot be solved together at the same time. All right, the awakening in your mind, of course, of more than one motive, more than one emotion, more than one, idea that you cannot resolve at the same time. All right, and of course, just like social conflicts, psychological conflicts can also, be either severe or not necessarily severe. And for instance, there are instances given also on that slide. For instance, if you have, if you have two desires as to you have two very attractive job offers or career paths, and then you're trying to decide which of these job offers do you select. Of course, those are two motives. Those are two emotions that are active in your mind. Um, Conflicting interests. There are two interests, two job offers that are conflicting, and that is a conflict, even though it is happening inside your mind. All right. Now, it might not be as devastating as when you don't like your job, or you don't like your parents, and then you don't like the way your parents treat you. as an example, you know. But of course, you cannot run away from home because you don't know where else to run to. All right. That could be a more devastating, the result of that kind of this second example, of you not liking how your parents treat you, but still not being able to run away from the house because, I mean, where do you run to? You know, the result of that conflict might be more devastating when you compare with trying to choose from two attractive job offers. So you see that the level of severity of these psychological conflicts, these two scenarios of psychological conflicts that I've painted, are different. All right. So the level of damage as well that can occur, that can result from psychological conflicts, also vary. All right. But it's important to note that conflicts may not always be sociological. They may not always include um, other people trying to cause harm, trying to um, threaten the influence, interests, um, aspirations of other people. Conflicts can always also happen psychologically. Conflicts can happen inside your head, in your mind, and sometimes they can be devastating. They can lead to depression. They can lead to anxiety. They can lead to, they can even lead to death, suicide. All right. So those are very, very severe psychological conflicts. And some other times, they can just lead to indecision, poor judgment, and other conflicts, that other results that might not necessarily be very, very severe. And in fact, in other cases too, they can lead to innovation, development, progress. You know, so the consequences can vary, just like it varies also in social conflicts. All right. Now, the philosophy or approaches to conflict, there are three of them that are listed here. And it's important that we understand these three approaches to conflict, these three ways by which conflict can be understood, can be um, can be can be perceived. All right. The first one is the classical view, which is more traditional, and this view insists that conflict, you know, has to do with a malfunctioning within a group. So wherever you have conflict, it means that something has gone wrong. There's a malfunction. There is a problem, within such a group. All right, and of course, the conflicts we're referring to here are mostly sociological conflicts. Because they involve in groups. Psychological conflicts are the ones that mostly or um, occur, you know, in the mind, in the psychology of an individual. All right, but sociological conflicts occur in groups of more than one person. So the classical or traditional view of conflict means that when conflicts occurs in a group, something in that group has gone wrong, either in terms of leadership, or in terms of policy execution, or in terms of achieving the goals of the group. Something has gone wrong, and that's why the conflict has occurred. And so the classical view or traditional view of conflict sees conflict as a very, very um, bad event which should be avoided. you know as much as possible, we should try to avoid conflict. But the second approach is the human relations approach, and here it's argued that conflict, is a natural occurrence. Wherever you have individuals, interacting, then conflict is bound to occur. And so, rather than try to avoid conflict outrightly, which is almost impossible, we must try to manage it as much as possible. Manage it to the extent, so much so that it doesn't result in devastating, dangerous consequences. All right, that's what the human relations approach to conflict says or argues, that conflict is natural. Wherever you have people interacting, wherever you have human relations, conflict is inevitable. And so, rather than trying to avoid it, which is mostly unlikely, we must try to manage it. The third approach is the interactionist approach. The interactionist approach. This is slightly related to the human relations approach, but here the emphasis is on the fact that um, conflict is necessary for groups to perform effectively. So, in order for groups to function properly, conflicts are necessary. All right, and of course, the kind of conflicts here are not conflicts of course, obviously, are not conflicts that would result in bodily harm or in in loss of life and property. The kind of conflicts that I refer to here are conflicts that will propel motivation, that will propel innovation, functional kinds of conflicts. And of course, there's also some differentiation between functional conflicts and dysfunctional conflicts. All right, but functional conflicts are the ones that the interactionists argue are necessary for organizations or groups to engage in. All right, because they support group goals, they improve performance. Where you set up teams, you give those teams tasks to compete and come up with an idea or a product or a brand that will help to boost the image of whether it's a company you're running or a business. So functional conflicts help to promote the objectives and goals, aspirations of the group, whereas dysfunctional conflicts, hinder group performance. All right, but the conflicts that are encouraged in the interactionist approach are functional conflicts as opposed to dysfunctional conflicts. All right, so these three approaches are three major approaches from which we can perceive and understand, try to understand conflicts or try to explain conflicts. And now one might be wondering, how are these different from the three that we talked about in trying to teach the three dimensions we talked about in trying to explain conflicts. Remember that in those three dimensions where we talked about the um, the distant past, the immediate past, and the current event, what we meant in those three dimensions is trying to explain conflict events. All right, so for instance, you're trying to explain, why has a conflict occurred? Why are these two groups, exchanging, or these two individuals exchanging punches? Why do you have um um why do you have somebody who has been sacked from his or her job? you know why has somebody been sacked from his or her job? Why exactly has conflict occurred? In order to understand those particular conflict events, it's important to try to understand them from these three perspectives, because if you want to just understand why two individuals are punching or are exchanging punches, and then you find out that, oh, they're exchanging punches because this person picked up this person's um, clothes from the hanger and without permission. That's not enough to exchange punches. That doesn't sufficiently explain why two individuals will exchange punches just because I took your clothes from the hanger without your permission. That doesn't, yes, it can explain, to a large extent, but it doesn't give you the complete picture. All right, it is important to find out, in the last 48 hours, what has been the relationship of these two people. Have they been in talking terms? Have they been friends? Or have they had a disagreement before this event of taking his clothes without his permission from the hanger? What has been their relationship in the last 24 hours, 48 hours? It's also important to understand, you know how long have they known themselves? For how long have they been friends? What has been their friendship, the condition of their friendship for the last 1 year? Talking about the distant past. So that's what we are talking about in those three dimensions of trying to explain conflict. But here in the philosophy, we are understanding, we are talking about the perspectives from which people try to understand, or from which people understand conflict generally. you know the function of conflict, what conflict does in groups particularly. All right, so we're saying that the classical view of conflict um, sees conflict as very, very dangerous. That's the classical view. So somebody who is of the classical view of conflict will always say that you should try to avoid conflict. Conflicts are very, very bad. conflicts are very, very destructive. So just try to avoid conflict. That's what somebody who is thinking, along the classical view of conflict will say. Somebody who is thinking along the interactionist view will say, oh, conflicts are necessary, depending on the conflict, depending on the kind of conflict. And they will always try to create an environment where healthy conflict, where there's healthy competition, because they feel that such healthy competition would result in certain kinds of innovation or progress, that will help to further the goal of the group. All right, and so also is the case with the human relations approach, which will say that, oh, it is natural that human relations, will experience some kind of conflict, but let's manage it to ensure that the conflict doesn't go out of hand. So in explaining these two categories of approaches, the first one in trying to explain particular conflicts, this second one trying to explain the philosophy of conflict, the thinking, behind how people perceive conflict, the reasoning behind how conflict is perceived. I hope you understand the point we're making. So these philosophies are more broad approaches, more broad, world views, windows into how people understand and view conflict. Whereas the previous one is, or refers to specific levels of trying to explain particular conflict events. All right. If you have questions, of course, we can always discuss this further. Now, peace. Peace as the other leg to conflict, um, is said to have evolved also from human existence ab initio. Now, it's important to understand or to mention here in this, before we progress, it's important to mention that the difference, or in trying to separate peace and conflict, um, as two academic fields of study will be difficult, because the two of them are closely linked together. Peace and conflict are closely linked together as an academic discipline. The differences between these two these two aspects of the same discipline, you know, is very, very thin. And so in trying to explain peace, you see that conflict comes in. In trying to explain conflict, you see that peace, comes in as well. So that's just a passing statement to say that peace and conflict are very closely linked together, and as such, they should be understood, in that light. So I've said that um, people have perceived, and scholars have perceived that peace is a natural process. It began, it is inherent in human interactions to be peaceful. All right, and so um, peace, was the condition of society before corruption came in. But the question is, when did the corruption come? What was the origin of the corruption? We don't have an answer to that. All right. So best also observe that peace is a state of perfection. You know, of course, perfection in this sense is subjective, because what exactly does perfection mean? We don't really know. All right, a state of perfection, an expression of God's kingdom, um, that is yet to be uncorrupted, or that is yet to be corrupted. That's a typographical error, that is yet to be corrupted. Okay, so the question exactly is, what do you mean by perfection? What do you mean by the state of perfection? How do we understand perfection in the context of the lack of corruption? Of course, if we say we are looking at perfection from the state of the absence of corruption, then it also throws up another argument. What corruption, in what sense? Corruption, because corruption also has various sides to it. So the point is that peace as well, just like conflict, is also very subjective. Is also very it's a very complex concept, which is difficult also to to define or to explain. All right. But the point is that peace is the absence of conflict, the absence of a clash of interest, which we said was the general um, definition of conflict. So peace and conflict are more like word and opposite. All right, they are opposites of one another. So conflict is the clash of interest. Peace is the absence of such a clash of interest. Um, and the question is, at what point, and how often do we not have clashes in interest? How often do we have such a tranquil state, such an uncorrupt state, such a perfect state? How often do we have that? And how do we determine that as well? How do we define that as well? So the big question, which you see there in bold, is where did the desire um come from? Going back now to the biblical perspective, where we talked about the desire, um, greed, corruption that came, into the mind of the dragon, and resulted in the actions that led to the war in heaven. Where did those emotions, where did those motivations come from? The answer is still unknown. All right. So the evolution of peace is shrouded in so much mystery as well. It's shrouded in so much mystery, and the question is, how frequent, how significant, you know, is the peace that we experience as individuals or even in groups? How significant and how frequent, do we not have clash of interests? All of those are questions that should be running through our minds. As an academic discipline, peace studies or peace research developed, a little towards the end of the Second World War. Between the First and Second World War, that's when the discipline of peace and conflict studies began. Because prior to this, prior to the two world wars, there hasn't really been any academic emphasis on the likelihood of a conflict that had that kind of magnitude, or peace, calm after such a conflict. There hadn't really been any emphasis or investigation, empirical research into into these two into these two conditions. And so after the First World War, um, the discipline picked up a little, and of course dragged until towards the end of the Second World War, when it finally became deeply rooted. All right, and so far in the last couple of years, the discipline has become multidisciplinary. Peace and conflict studies have become multidisciplinary. You find lawyers talking about conflict and peace. You find even scientists talking about conflict and peace. You find psychologists, philosophers, historians. Peace and conflict studies has become largely multidimensional. All right. So it is said that peace studies rather is a method of inquiry or practice that is concerned with understanding the causes of violence, the conditions for peaceful society. So you see again peace and conflict coming together. The causes of violence, the conditions for peace. The causes for violence, the conditions for peace. So that's why I said that the two concepts cannot be easily separated. They are largely connected, and of course, um, they seem like siblings, more or less. So the aim of peace studies is to try and create peace, whether within or without individuals or groups, and to try prevent wars from occurrence. So that is the origin, of peace, whether as an academic discipline and in a more broader context, outside of the academic discipline, as a condition, peace as a condition, and of course peace also as an area of study. All right. Now, in addition to the research aspect of peace, peace has also been a movement, or peace has also evolved as a movement. Even though most people have argued that this movement of peace, is connected with democratic practices and societies, where individuals protest certain policies or programs, or protest certain government actions, peaceful protests, the concept of peaceful protests, um, are limited to democracies. But you find out that even in traditional societies, there were certain grassroots movements, there were certain grassroots mobilizations that sought to to agitate certain policies, certain programs, and even in the contemporary society, in the modern society that we live, you have human rights movements, you have um, environmental enthusiasts, you have even internet, digital age enthusiasts, people who canvass, for a peaceful internet society, a peaceful internet usage or internet culture. So peace movements have also become largely multiplied. They have multiplied over the years beyond just involved in democratic practices or democratic societies. They have grown, you know, and this growth, of course, has exceeded the 1945 period and even to contemporary society as well. All right. So we have looked at the evolution of peace from three perspectives. Number one is the condition of peace, which we said is very subjective. How do you define perfection? How do you define the absence of corruption? How do you define a condition, you know, um, that is perfect? Basically, is difficult to do because what perfection means for one person might be different from what it means for another person. And the question again is how often, in fact, do you experience that condition of perfection? However, whatever perfection means to you, how often do you experience or do you enjoy that condition? You know that doesn't have clash of interest. That is devoid of a clash of interest. All right. We've also looked at peace from an academic perspective, which we said resulted, you know, in the periods between the First and the Second World War as an academic discipline. And we have looked at peace as a movement, a social movement as well. Where you have movements that tend to um, tend to promote and emphasize peaceful practices in various aspects, whether it's the environment, whether it's on the internet, whether it is in the workplace, whether it is related to gender issues, and so many other issues, and even nuclear issues as well. So peace movements have also become very, very paramount. So those are three areas of the evolution of peace: as a condition, as an academic discipline, as well as a movement. All right. Now, seven characteristics or features of peace research. And remember, we said that it's difficult to alienate conflicts from this as well. So you will see some um, features or characteristics of conflict also in these features of peace. All right. Number one, we said that peace studies is a problem solving field. So peace research or peace studies tends to provide solution to some of the clash of interests, that exists in the various areas that they exist. Peace tries to proffer, solutions, tries to solve the problem, tries to create for peaceful um, conditions for peace, conditions for enduring relationships. That's number one. Number two is that it is also a multidisciplinary field of study, and we said that also for conflict. Conflict is equally multidisciplinary. All right. So peace transcends various disciplines or transcends just political science, as it were. Peace in public health, you talk about peace. In social work, you talk about peace. In medical field, you talk about peace, you know, and what have you. So peace transcends just political science. It is multidisciplinary. All right. Number three is that peace focuses on non-violent processes of political change, social change, and change in whatever other areas of life. Non-violence. All right. So this is a functional kind of um, peace emphasizes functional conflicts basically, and if we have to resolve this conflict, then it has to be non-violent. If you have to engage in conflict, it has to be non-violent. All right. So that's another feature or characteristics of peace. Number four is that peace is concerned with a multi-level analysis of complex conflict transformation. And what do we mean here? We're saying that in trying to understand conflict, or in trying to understand peace, as it refers to conflict transformation. Conflict transformation is a process, of moving from conflict to peace. That's what conflict transformation is. All right, and we're saying that that process involves various levels of analysis. All right, various levels of analysis, just like we did in trying to understand conflict as well, from the various levels of analysis: the distant past, the immediate past, as well as the current event. So also peace involves multiple levels of analysis: peacemaking, peacekeeping, peace building. All of those are processes that are involved in moving from conflict to peace. So that's the point we're making. It involves a multi-level analysis. Number five is that peace is focused on cross-cultural issues. All right, peace is not centric to political issues alone or social issues. Peace extends beyond political issues or social issues to various other issues across cultures, you know, issues of health, issues of the environment, issues of food, issues of of technology, transportation. All of these are global cross-cultural issues that peace is also involved in. Number six is that peace focuses on a combination of objective analysis and normative commitments. What do we mean? We're saying that in trying to achieve peace, there's a need for objective analysis. There's a need to be exact, to be blunt, to be objective. There's also room for subjectivity, right? There's also room for subjective analysis. So you must have a right mix of emotion and logic in trying to achieve peace. It's not just objective, logical. There's also some aspect of emotion, of norms, feelings, values in trying to achieve peace. So it's a combination of both. All right. And finally, peace maintains close relationship between theory and practice. All right. Between research and activism. So the things that are done in peace as an academic discipline must must relate with those that are done with peace or in peace as a movement. All right. So there shouldn't be any disconnect between any aspect of peace. Peace, the peace process must be properly connected together. Must be closely related. If peace would have a very useful effect, and achieve its objective. Now, the basic concepts of peace studies, there are three of them, and they include peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building. Well, I've mentioned this while I was talking about the multi-level analysis, involved in peace studies. These are three very important levels or aspects of the peace of what is called the peace process. All right, there are three important aspects of what is called the peace process. So the peace process is made up of what is called the peacemaking, the peacekeeping, as well as the peace building. These are aspects of the peace process. All right. Now, what is peacekeeping, or what is the peacemaking about? Peacemaking, involves peaceful ways of resolving disputes. Peaceful, non-violent ways of resolving disputes. They could be diplomatic, they could be judicial, they could be spiritual. As long as they're peaceful and as long as they are non-restrictive. There's some people who say, okay, let's talk about peace, but see this area, don't go this way. I mean, that is a restrictive kind of peacemaking, and that might not lead to the desired kind of peace. So peacemaking must be non-restrictive, and it must be non-violent, in trying to resolve dispute. Peacekeeping also involves a set of activities that are aimed at creating lasting conditions of peace. Of course, when conflicts occur, among groups, um, there there tends to be certain sanctions that result, from such conflicts. There may be other external factors that will try to enforce peace. Especially when conflicts are ongoing. Certain external factors or external authorities may want to enforce peace, and that also happens within within the larger states structure that we have. You see that when countries like Mali are at war, or countries like Gabon, Sudan are at war, the international community, the larger international system wants to enforce peace, and so you have peacekeeping troops that are sent to enforce peace, to ensure that people stop fighting. you know and where it is difficult, where you have parties that are not conforming, you can have sanctions as well. All right, so all of these activities, sanctions, occur um, after the peacekeeping process. I take that again. The activities, sanctions, enforcement that I've talked about, occur before the peacekeeping process. So in keeping the peace, you want to ensure that a condition, the conditions are right, that the conditions are set in place for peace to be built, for peace, lasting peace to occur. All right. So peacekeeping basically are those activities that help to create environment for lasting peace. All right, and we can list some of those activities. You know, Elections, maybe free and fair elections, social justice, fairness, equity. All of these things are things that activities that help to keep the peace. All right, dialogue, very very important. Communication, very very important activity. That helps to create lasting peace. Now, peace building, as the third and final process in final aspect of the peace process, or activity in the peace process, you know, is a more broad agenda. It has a more larger scope. Whereas why? Because in peace building, you are trying to you're trying to secure the peace that already exists or that has been achieved. All right, you're trying to secure the peace that has been achieved, and you do that by fighting corruption, by insisting on humanitarian programs, education, welfare services, infrastructure, healthcare, and what have you. So the point is that in the peace process, peacemaking is important, peacekeeping is important, you know, by way of dialogue and communication lines open, parties coming to the table, grievances expressed, in a very free and non-judgmental atmosphere. All right, and then peace building to ensure that the peace that exists is lasting, is sustainable, it can stand the test of time. All right, peacekeeping is laying the conditions necessary, whereas peace building is um, peace building involves involves emphasizing building on those conditions that have already been laid in the peacekeeping process. I don't know, I hope my point is made, you know. So the point you're making is that in all of these, there's usually a very thin line in the peace conversation, because almost all these aspects are linked. You know, you also need dialogue in peacemaking. You also need dialogue in peace building. You need dialogue in peacekeeping. You need to ensure that there's limited corruption in peace building. The same with peacemaking. The same with peacekeeping. And so you find out that in trying to explain either of them, you might be overlapping in your explanation, and that's okay. But the point is to understand the very thin difference that occurs between them. Peacemaking, you know, is a process of getting warring parties to 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 come to the table and discuss, to stop the violence. That is peacemaking. You're trying to resolve a conflict. You're trying to stop the violence from occurring. You're trying to solve the problem. That's peacemaking. Peacekeeping involves the activities that are engaged in after the violence has stopped. How do you resolve the misunderstanding? How do you how do you ensure that the conflict that was occurring before, does not reoccur again? How do you solve the issues that led to the conflict in the first place? That's peacekeeping. All right. And then peace building, of course, refers to building on, you know, emphasizing on maintaining um, the the peace that has already been achieved. All right. So those are the three aspects of in the peace process, and it's important that we understand these aspects. In conclusion, we've said that conflict is a natural and of course, mostly inevitable aspect of human life. I've talked about the fact that conflicts can also be productive, so they must not only be violent and destructive. Conflict, you know, the origin of conflict as well as the origin of peace remains remains a mystery. Whereas, of course, although one can argue that the origin of peace is known, in the sense that peace peace, of course, is the state before you had any kind of corruption, or agitation, pride, clash of interests, um, altering that calm, that perfection. All right. But also the question that comes to mind is, how do to what extent do you enjoy this peace? To what extent um, can peace be enjoyed? All right. But in terms of origin, well, we know that God is the author of peace, is the source of peace. You know, so we know that that is the origin of peace. Unlike conflict, God is not the author of conflict. He's not the author of confusion. So the origin of conflict remains a mystery. All right. We've talked about the sociological understanding of conflict. Where there's a threat to interest, to purpose. There's a there's some kind of action to try and cause harm, bodily harm, injury. We've talked about the psychological um, conflict as well. Where there are two motive, two motives, two ideas, two emotions that cannot be resolved at the same time, and so there's a dilemma. We also talked about the approaches. Traditional approach, conflict is bad, should be avoided. The human relations approach, conflict is inevitable, let's manage it. And of course, the interaction is conflict is needed. Functional conflict, let's have conflict that can help us produce results. All right. We've said that conflict and peace are very, very similar concepts, and of course, they share most characteristics together. They are both multidisciplinary. They are both cross-cultural, you know, and what have you. So this is where we're going to stop in the conversation for today. If you have questions, particularly relating to the dimensions of trying to explain conflict events, as well as the 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 philosophies or approaches to conflict, then of course let's let's have those questions. Let's ask those questions, and maybe we'll try to provide further answer. further answers. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you for listening.